One of the stranger things that can happen after narcissistic abuse is that decisions that used to feel pretty ordinary can suddenly feel enormous. And I'm not necessarily talking about the objectively big decisions. Sometimes it's what to say in a message, whether to accept an invitation, whether to spend the money, whether to bring something up, whether to say yes, whether to say no. You may find yourself sitting with a decision much longer than the decision itself seems to justify. You think about what could happen if you choose one way. Then, what could happen if you choose the other? You reconsider something you already decided. Maybe you ask someone else what they think. And somehow, even after they answer, you're still not sure. After a while, the difficulty deciding can become another thing you use against yourself. You start wondering why you can't just choose anymore. Why everything has to feel like such a big production. Why someone who used to be perfectly capable of making decisions now feels so much pressure around getting them right. But there's an important distinction here. Sometimes a decision feels high stakes, not because the decision is unusually important, but because being wrong has become unusually expensive in your mind. And that changes the experience of choosing. Most of us think about decision-making pretty simply. You consider what matters, you make your best judgment, you choose. Sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you don't. That's normally just part of making decisions. But after prolonged relational destabilization, something quieter can change. Not necessarily your ability to evaluate your options. What can change is what it means to be wrong. If your choices were repeatedly criticized, questioned, overridden, mocked, blamed, or used against you later, a decision can stop feeling like a simple expression of judgment. It can start to feel more like exposure, because now there's something riding on the choice beyond the choice itself. It's not just, what do I want to do? There may also be this quieter question underneath it, such as, what happens if I get this wrong? When a decision starts carrying the burden of proving whether you can trust yourself, even small choices can become psychologically heavy. The size of the decision hasn't necessarily changed. The meaning attached to it has. And this can explain something that otherwise feels pretty contradictory. You can be highly competent and still struggle to decide. You can manage complicated responsibilities at work, solve problems for other people, handle emergencies, function really well in situations where the path is relatively clear. And then, somehow, you find yourself stuck on a choice that seems much smaller. And that can be incredibly confusing. But competence and decisional authority aren't exactly the same thing. You may still know how to evaluate information. You may still be intelligent. You may still have good judgment. What may feel less available is the sense that your own judgment can carry enough weight to stand. And when you look at it that way, decision paralysis starts to mean something different. It isn't automatically evidence that you've become incapable of making decisions. Sometimes, what has changed is how much psychological consequence has become attached to making one. A choice is no longer only a choice. It can quietly become a test of whether your judgment can be trusted. And when that much meaning is attached to choosing, Someone else agreeing with you can feel unusually relieving. Not necessarily because they know better. Their agreement just makes the choice feel less exposed. Sometimes reassurance feels like clarity because it temporarily takes some of the weight off of your own judgment. That doesn't make needing reassurance a character flaw. It just helps explain why deciding can feel so much heavier than the decision itself seems to warrant. So, if ordinary decisions have started feeling strangely consequential, the difficulty itself doesn't tell you that your judgment has disappeared. Sometimes the decision is carrying more psychological weight than the decision itself requires. And being able to place some of that weight differently can make the experience less personally confusing. Many survivors find that decisions begin to carry less psychological weight over time. There's no requirement for every decision to feel easy, and there's no need to use uncertainty as another measure of how well you're recovering. For now, it may be enough to understand why choosing can feel so much heavier than it used to. If you're noticing how much pressure ordinary decisions have started carrying, especially when choosing feels tied to whether you can trust yourself, the 30-day stabilization space is something structured you can step into while you navigate this period, without requiring every choice to resolve the larger question of self-trust. The link is below if you want to step into it. And if continuing to orient here is what feels appropriate right now, there's room for that too. Sometimes the decision was never as heavy as everything you learned to believe being wrong would mean. We'll pause here.